Hello, everyone. Welcome to TDWI's webinar program. I'm Linda Briggs. I'm a contributing editor for TDWI, and I'll be your moderator. Our webinar is titled, How the Right BI Can Fundamentally Change Your Organization. Our sponsor today is Looker. And for today's presentations, we'll first hear from Fern Helper, our Director of Research for Advanced Analytics here at TDWI. And then we have a short presentation from a Looker customer, and then we're going to move into a panel discussion. So for the panel itself, we have speakers from both Looker, who, as I said, is our sponsor today, and Twilio, a Looker customer. They're going to discuss their BI implementation. From Looker, our speaker is Zach Taylor, who is the Product Marketing Manager with Looker. And joining us from Twilio, we have a couple folks. Charlie Shu, is the technical lead of the data warehousing and BI team there at Twilio. And Jessica Zan is the performance marketing lead at Twilio. So welcome to all our panelists. Before we get started, I want to go over just a couple background items with the audience, and then I'll turn things over to Fern. First of all, our webinar will be about an hour long. That includes a Q&A period at the end of the presentations. That's when we entertain audience questions. So if you have a question for any of our speakers at any time during the webinar, please go ahead and type it in there on your console and send it over. And again, we'll get to those toward the end of the webinar. If you run into any technical issues, there is a help area there in your console. You can click on that for some suggestions. To discuss this webinar on Twitter, if you'd like to do that, the hashtag is TDWI. And finally, as always, we are recording today's event. We'll be emailing each of you an email with a link to the archived version, so you can revisit the webinar yourself or share that link with colleagues if you'd like to do that. Okay, again, today's presentation is how the right BI can fundamentally change your organization. Leading our presentation today is Fern Helper. Fern is TDWI's Director of Research for Advanced Analytics. She is a highly recognized expert in the field of analytics with more than 20 years of experience in data and business analysis. Fern has published hundreds of reports and articles on data mining and information technology and is frequently quoted on that subject in the press. She's also co-authored several books on topics including cloud computing, hybrid cloud, and service-oriented architecture, and her latest book is Big Data for Dummies. So Fern, let me turn things over to you here to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Linda, and I want to echo Linda's welcome and thank everyone for taking time out of their schedules today to join us for this panel session, on how the right BI can fundamentally change your organization. So here's what we're going to do today. I think Linda went through some of this, but first I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what we're seeing at TDWI in terms of trends in data access and self-service BI and BI. And then, as Linda mentioned, we're actually going to have some real users of self-service BI and data access. Twilio, which is a communications company, talk about their journey with self-service BI and what they're doing. And then we're going to have a roundtable discussion, which I think will be pretty interesting. And then we'll have audience Q&A. So I want to start off by saying something that hopefully many of you know, and this is about the business benefits of being a data-driven and analytics-driven organization. So I talk about this a lot, and I just want to, in addition to TDWI's research that illustrates some of the benefits around top and bottom line impact for those organizations that are using analytics, I wanted to pull in some other information from external sources. For example, an MIT study on analytics, I think that was done with IBM, that showed that companies' performance and analytics are clearly connected. There's this book by Tom Davenport, Competing on Analytics, which many people look at when they think about, how to sort of set up their analytics culture. And there's a, down on the lower left-hand side of the screen, there's a study that people talk about a lot that shows that companies that are data-driven are more profitable, like they're 5 or 6% more profitable, and that's what this reference is in relation to. So if your company is not using data to drive decisions and is not starting to move into BI and analytics, I would say please don't wait too long because the clock is ticking and, it's really an important thing to actually start to be very data-driven. The situation in many businesses is different, however. About a year ago, my colleague Dave Stoddard and I actually published this assessment tool called the Analytics Maturity Model. And it's actually on our site. You can go there, you can take it, and it's really a benchmark assessment where organizations can go in and actually benchmark where they are in terms of their maturity with analytics, and they can look at all organizations of their same size, that sort of thing. So it's a useful tool to sort of go in and see where you stand. But what happens in many organizations, and we see this, is that early in the analytics journey, maybe the situation looks familiar to you. Excel turns out to be the major quote-unquote BI tool. And if the business wants to get data to analyze, they send a request to IT, where I have business down here on the lower right, and they send this request to IT, who's the guardian of the data. And then IT either does the analysis themselves, if the user sort of, has to usually write up this requirements type of document, or sends the data back to the business, and then the business dumps that data into Excel, and then they analyze the data. And then off to the right, you can see some of these other files, because typically business also brings in some of these other files that they may have generated internally. And, then they're analyzing all of this in Excel. So my view is that this is not the ideal situation, because it can be time-consuming, with these requests, and, Excel can be error-prone. And IT is the gate, and it can take longer than necessary to actually get the data that the business wants back from IT, and who knows what files the business sort of created off to the right. A business and IT even sort of working together in this scenario. And where are the BI tools that are past the spreadsheets? That itself can be very error-prone and limiting. So, we see this very often, and this is what we often refer to as sort of a nascent stage of analytics maturity. So enter self-service BI. And this is what we see. This is a major trend that TDWI sees happening out there. And self-service BI, the way we define it, is that it allows users to access and analyze data with less dependence on IT. So I have, IT in the business, and the idea is that, this is making everyone happy. So the idea is that business users are utilizing a set of tools and practices and processes for actually deriving meaningful information out of data, and it's supporting these informed decisions. And these self-service BI tools and applications often bring together capabilities for data access. There's querying tools sometimes, there's analysis capabilities, there's reporting, and there's presentation capabilities. So it can be very empowering to the business user. So, this democratization trend is a trend that is an important trend, and it's one that we've been seeing over the last 3 to 5 years. So it's driven by the fact that these tools are becoming much easier to use. I mean, there's a number of reasons why it's being driven, but the analytics, the BI and the data access tools are becoming much easier to use. So vendors are providing a better and more user-friendly way to get at data. There's also much nicer visualization tools that allow the business users to slice and dice and shake and bake and then explore their data and iterate on their analysis and gain lots of insight for decision making. This is even happening in more advanced analytics, like predictive analytics. So whereas in the past, where the UIs were basically these scripting languages, vendors are moving to more point and click and drag and drop types of interfaces. So the trend is that that's opening up these technologies to business users also, because it's making things easier. So often these self-service capabilities are part of a larger analytics platform or some sort of platform where all of this functionality is packaged together. So what are some of the benefits and issues around, this notion of self-service BI? So I think that, the benefits are pretty clear. I mean, besides sort of flexibility and agility, this is making both business and IT more productive. So IT is not caught up in dealing with day-to-day requests from the business, and self-service opens up analytics to more users and organizations. So these organizations become more data-driven, which can then lead to these top and bottom line impacts, because they're using data to make decisions, and they're using it to help drive their business. So there's lots of benefits to this. On the flip side, there's some issues, and a big issue that shouldn't go away is it shouldn't mean that data management and governance goes away. So IT can be the stewards of the data, but they're sharing the data. And at the same time, they're dealing with the governance and management of the data. You know, what happens a lot of times is that often in their rush to get some sort of capability up and running because of some perceived business need, the business feels that IT can't meet the need, and the business sets up their own environment. You know, this is often called shadow IT. And this can work sometimes if the business users are careful, but it can lead to a lot of data issues down the road, and I mean like data inconsistency issues. There's also security threats that can come up from shadow IT. And so a best practice is often to have IT supporting the business and the two groups working together. We'll hear more about that today, I think. So that data is managed and governed, but it's not cloistered, and and business is using it. But there's also obviously, I think, that business should be trained on some of these tools. We're doing some research now on emerging technologies, where the importance of training is really sort of coming out. Even though business has access to the tools, it doesn't mean that they know all the time how to use them. So there needs to be some of that happening as well. So as I said, self-service BI is happening. We're doing this research, and I wanted to just show you, before I hand it back over to Linda, what the status of some of what's happening in self-service BI is. So this data is actually from our most recent best practice report that hasn't even been published yet. So the data, the numbers are already changing, but I think that the patterns are consistent. And this is actually on emerging technologies, and in it we're asking actually a number of questions about self-service data preparation and self-service data access and self-service BI. So we asked in this research, are you using self-service data preparation now, or planning to use it in 3 years from now, or using self-service drag and drop data access now, 3 years from now, self-service BI now, 3 years from now. And you could see in the gray that 30% of the respondents were using some sort of self-service data preparation tool now, and another 30% about are planning to use it in the next 3 years. Likewise with the drag and drop data access now and 3 years from now. And then more than that, over 50% were using some version of some sort of self-service BI now. And we're seeing that in a lot of research that we're doing. So organizations are interested in being able to do the work themselves. They want self-service. Over 50%, as I said, they're using some sort of self-service BI now. A lot of that's in these visualization tools. So they want to be able to do self-service. And the idea of self-service discovery is very, very important to many organizations. As I mentioned in previous research, I saw that over 60% of respondents were already using some sort of visualization tool in their organization. So now these respondents, want to do more with this. Now I say that, 50 or 60% of the respondents are using it in their organization. That doesn't mean that 60% of the users in the organization are using self-service BI. It just means that 60% of the organizations are using it. It's penetrating into these organizations. Right now, I'd say that the penetration is about 20 to 25% in these companies. And interestingly, some organizations are even planning self-service data access on big data platforms like Hadoop. We're starting to see that in the data that's coming back from this recent emerging technology report. So the data stored in Hadoop, Hadoop becomes a data source for analysis, and some organizations even want to give their business people access to the data that's in Hadoop. So the point of all of this is that at TDWI, we're definitely seeing the emergence of self-service data access in BI. It's happening, organizations want it, they're getting value from it, and when IT is involved, the best practice is for business and IT to work together. So that we can avoid this next version of the spread mart. So with that, I want to hand it over to Linda, who's going to introduce our next speakers. Linda?
Yeah, thank you, Fern. So as we said, we have 3 guest panelists who are joining Fern today, and I wanted to introduce them. They're going to give us a couple of brief presentations, and then we're going to move into the panel discussion. So just very quickly, Zach Taylor is the product marketing manager with Looker. Zach was an early data analyst at Looker, and he's worked with numerous teams to analyze data and implement BI strategies. Prior to Looker, Zach was a financial analyst and startup founder. And from Twilio, the customer is going to speak today. We have Charlie Hsu. Charlie is the technical lead for the data warehouse and business intelligence team at Twilio. His team has grown to oversee a thriving data ecosystem, consuming data from databases, third-party tools, and pipelines to fuel a data warehouse, BI tools, and real-time analytics use cases. And we're going to learn more about that today from the Twilio folks. Also from Twilio, we have Jessica Zan. Jessica is the performance marketing lead at Twilio, focusing on user behavior analytics and optimizing conversion rates through various channels, including paid ads and search engine optimization. So, Zach, I think I'm going to turn things over to you to take it from here.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Linda. So I'll only spend a minute here just with giving a very quick introduction to Looker and to myself, and then I'll turn it over to Charlie and Jessica to talk about Twilio and their use case. But as Linda mentioned, I do product marketing at Looker, and before that I was an analyst on our team analyzing data with a number of companies for about a year. So Looker is business intelligence software, and we definitely subscribe to the philosophy that Fern articulated earlier in her presentation. We provide a self-service analytics platform, but we also have a modeling layer that enables the data team to curate and govern data from a centralized place. So I won't go into any more detail now. We're growing really quickly, and we've had great user adoption. This is a quick look at a few of our customers, and I'll probably leave it there. I do have a slide with my contact info and info for Looker, which will also be displayed at the end of the presentation during Q&A. But if you do have additional questions, you can go to our website or you can reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to cover those. And that's all I want to introduce, so I'll turn it over to Charlie.
Hey everybody, so yes, this is Charlie from Twilio. I'll give a quick introduction on what Twilio actually does. Let me push the slide. So Twilio provides a communications API, so our target audience is developers, and it enables those developers to make phone calls, send text messages, make voice over IP functionality, and embed that into their web, desktop, and mobile software. So the typical Twilio workflow is a developer can purchase a phone number, and then they can route calls and messages from the outside world into Twilio. And then they can do whatever sort of developer logic they would like to do, control the call flow, gather digits, record the call, save it for later, and just basically provide intelligent responses back to the user. So send the text message back, control the call flow, and that sort of stuff. And given the nature of our business, this communications platform, we end up with an incredibly rich data set. So, you can imagine having all of the different call data or message data and communication data stuck in some database. That ends up being an incredibly awesome data set, very multi-dimensional, right? And that fuels a lot of different diverse data needs across our company. Whether it's financial reporting or engineering, we're always trying to improve our call quality, the reliability of our services, and the performance. Or carrier analysis. Twilio is essentially acting as a carrier abstracting away other carriers. So our downstream carriers, we need to do a lot of analysis on which ones are performing well and not well. And of course, the general data needs across different parts of the organization, like marketing, sales, and product. So our data evolution has sort of taken a few steps. As Fern mentioned, we did start in that very primitive way of handling data requests. There would be a data need determined by some non-technical part of the company, and they would basically ship it over the wall, and an engineer would write a query and maybe a web interface around that query. And of course, the big problem there was, slow turnaround, difficult to assess product requirements, and sort of like interpretation by the engineer of what this data request really meant. Eventually, we got to the point where we would try and ship data to third-party vendors that would promise, the reporting and insights that whatever non-technical teams cared about. So one example of this would be Salesforce, where we would ship a bunch of data into Salesforce, and then hopefully that would just abstract away the sales reporting problem for them. That didn't really work out. All of those integrations were difficult to write and ended up being very inflexible. So then the next step was to basically make the data generally available, either in Amazon S3 as flat files or in some sort of SQL-based data warehouse. And this is the sort of here's the data, do with it what you will, and it worked out okay. It worked out best if you knew what you were querying. So it kind of required a lot of technical insight from the analysts and a lot of training and a lot of learning. And then I think the way we have tried to make that easier for people is to add this sort of BI tool abstraction on top of it. And our BI tool is Looker, and it has provided this great modeling layer for us to reuse logic on underlying data. So what do I mean by that? I mean, like, well, maybe someone comes up with some particularly clever SQL dimension, and that calculates the pace of an account's growth over the next month. And now with Looker, we can simply define that once, and then anyone can reuse that without having to write any SQL, without having to know that much technical knowledge. We get to reuse a lot of the business logic there. So basically, the unification of all the data into our data warehouse has really helped us stop all these disparate data source pulls when analysts are trying to do analysis. So before, we had data thrown in all sorts of different third-party systems, and then eventually we found that we were pulling it back out and then doing analysis in Excel. Now all of that data gets loaded from those third-party data sources into the Twilio data warehouse, and then Looker sits on top of it. And here is kind of the architectural overview of our stack. At the very top, we have the Twilio data sources that are managed by other teams. So those could range from things like relational databases that are powering actual applications built on Twilio, server logs that are stored in Amazon S3, third-party data sources like Mixpanel, Salesforce, Eloqua, as well as real-time data pipelines, streams hosted on Amazon Kinesis or Apache Kafka. Data team services basically take all of that data and load it into S3, whether it's our Python-based SQL ETL framework or a Python loader using these Salesforce, Mixpanel, Zendesk third-party APIs to pull the data, or real-time Kinesis or Kafka consumers. And eventually those all go to S3, which is our staging area for Amazon Redshift, our data warehouse technology. And then we provide the interfaces for data access on top of it. And this is where the self-service BI comes in. So, of course, we have Looker, the BI tool. We can also allow people to generally access the data through whatever SQL workbench they would like. We basically allow everyone at Twilio unfettered SQL access to our data warehouse. And then we also write custom data team services for specific use cases, maybe like a monthly data dump or something where neither of those are adequate. And this self-service BI strategy has really taken off, and a lot of different teams at the company have found it super useful. Just to knock through some of our use cases, you can imagine a sales rep reaching out to a customer who has dropped in spend. Our phone number inventory at Twilio is a huge data problem in itself. When we have to sell phone numbers to customers, we have to keep track of the different aspects of our inventory that are lacking, and it's an incredibly multi-dimensional table. So there could be things like area codes that are going short, different carriers that we have to keep track of, different countries that we need to keep track of. Phone numbers have different capabilities, like some of them can send SMS, some of them can send MMS. And being able to access that data set in a flexible way is incredibly important to us making sure that we have phone numbers in stock. financial planning and analysis, fraud detection, diagnosing call quality issues that our customer support team has to face. These are all different data-driven teams at Twilio that have really benefited from the flexibility that we have gotten out of Looker. So hopefully we'll be able to answer more of your questions about that and give you guys an even deeper look into how we're using it. But now I think I'd like to pass it back to Linda to kick off the roundtable discussion.
All right, thank you, Charlie. Yeah, just a quick reminder to the audience at this point as we move into our next section. If you have a question for any of our speakers, go ahead and send it over. Again, we're going to get to those toward the end of the event. And on that note, as Charlie said, we're going to move into our roundtable discussion. So once again, we've got Zach Taylor with Looker and Charlie Hsu and Jessica Zan with Twilio, and leading our panel, Fern Helper. So Fern, let me turn it over to you to move us along.
Okay, great. Thanks, Linda. All right, great. So let's move to the first question that I want to ask the panelists. And that question is, I want to ask you all about some of the challenges that organizations have with data access. And, so let's get at some of the challenges. Maybe, Jessica, you can lead us off, in terms of, Charlie touched on this a little bit more, but, a little bit when he was talking, but, what are some of the challenges that you are having with the data access from the business side, and then how are things sort of changing? And Charlie, what did your team do to help the business get access? You talked a little bit about this, but let's just delve into it a little bit more.
Sure. So as a business user in this case, I definitely went through the iterations with Charlie during the last couple of years, because definitely at the beginning phase, all of those data are stored in different systems, for example, like Eloqua, Salesforce, Mixpanel, etc. So as an analyst, I need to request data access to different systems, and also I sometimes have to manually write pig queries to pull data from our the data that is stored behind the Hadoop cluster, and then once I have all of those data in the Excel format, I will need to do a manual VLOOKUP to join all the tables together in local environment. So everything is on demand. There's a lot of turnaround time, and easily, like if somebody may be delaying, responding to the email, then the whole process might be delayed. So there are a lot of dependencies among other parties of the company in order for me to run a query. So, and then gradually, we move on to the Looker. So, so once we have the data actually loaded into our internal data warehouse, where I can actually run Looker reports that pull data directly from our internal data warehouse. So this way, I don't need to, manually send a request to different teams. Instead, I can communicate with Charlie in terms of what I will need, and then he can actually translate those business requests into the data ETL process. So that is like a transformation in a nutshell.
Yeah, and Jessica kind of hit the nail on the head when we think about data team's problems with data access. And data team kind of has this heroic crusade of liberating all the data at Twilio. So a lot of the data at Twilio ends up being locked away or totally inaccessible. Right? It might be sitting in a production database that's facing a customer that's under the Twilio firewall, and your typical business user can't just hit some production-facing customer database. So a lot of data teams' work is figuring out a safe extraction method that's amenable to both the database owners and our team, and to load that data into a queryable data warehouse. We may have to think about things like redacting some of the data. We'll have to think about load intervals, API limits. So some of our third-party loads have to think about API restrictions, and so we have to limit the impact of our loading process And we do list a few certain ways. We pull maybe from a database slave that only our team accesses, or we create our own set of API keys. But to get back to the question, liberating the data is one of the biggest things, and then providing a queryable interface for that. Data might also be in a difficult to query format. So data teams, I feel like, always need to be prepared to serialize and transform the data back into something queryable. And perhaps the last thing I want to mention on challenges around data access are, even once you access the data, you might not know as an analyst what that data actually represents. And I like to think of this as, data teams need to try and provide transparency around the dimensions that they're exposing in their warehouses. So one great example here that we've noticed at Twilio is that, we're basically loading the application databases that other teams create into the warehouse, as is, and hopefully the analysts can figure it out. But one thing we noticed was that, the table called messages, which holds all of our SMS messages, had a status column, and the status column was a bunch of integers. And all of our analysts were like, what do these integers mean? It's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we had to basically dig through a bunch of back-end code to find that, status number 0 equals called, and status number 2 equals delivered. So data teams need to think about, like, okay, well, how do we kind of annotate that metadata? And actually in Looker, we've been able to do something really cool where we take a SQL case statement and translate everything on the fly into whatever string, delivered, undelivered status that it actually corresponds to.
Interesting. Zach, do you have anything you want to add before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, no, I think basically what I would say would echo what both Charlie and Jessica said. The biggest challenge that we see is that there's a dependency on either IT or on the data team to access the data, and they just get inundated with data pull requests, and that has a couple of challenges. For one, it means that the turnaround time for business users and the ability for them to iterate on their questions and look at it in different ways on their own is limited, so they have limited access to the data. And then on the data analyst side, if they're spending the majority of their time doing these polls, they can't work on some of these problems that Charlie just articulated, like how do we unlock new data sources, how do we work on load intervals and API limits, modify our infrastructure and do some of the harder analysis. So it's sort of limiting on both ends, and I think that's kind of the biggest challenge that we've seen. And you're also distancing the people with the domain knowledge and the domain expertise from the people with the data expertise. And I think the result of that is you don't have business analysts coming up with cool dimensions like pace of account growth, which Charlie mentioned earlier. So if you can kind of remove that friction between the data and the domain expertise, there's a lot of value there.
Yeah. Well, let's talk also a little bit more about friction and bottlenecks, and maybe Charlie, you can start off with this one. But how can data teams efficiently support an organization's data needs to remove bottlenecks? I mean, we're talking about a different type of bottleneck there, but let's talk about bottlenecks.
Yeah, definitely. So one kind of core tenet on the Twilio data team that we've tried to adhere to is incremental progress and iteration. And the best way we've learned to unblock people is to simply load the data, in whatever form it originally came into the warehouse. We always have to start by giving people flexible and full access to the data, because as a data team, right, we're concerned about problems like optimizing our loads, making sure that we have a flexible, configurable framework to add new loads. We're not as concerned about the actual underlying data. And the analysts know better than us data engineers what really matters. So, if you can give the analysts immediate, flexible, and full access to the data, then they can figure out what kind of transformations need to be made afterwards if the raw form of the data is not enough. So that's kind of our first impression on loading data into the warehouse. Just get it in. The analysts will figure out how it needs to be transformed later. On the interface side, when we're talking about removing bottlenecks, we need to iterate towards easily accessible and flexible interfaces. So Looker, as the BI tool for Twilio, really allows our non-technical analysts to get started looking at the data without knowing any SQL. Funnily enough, the SQL it generates on the fly has actually ended up kind of being very instructional for some of our analysts. They end up learning like, oh, that's how like a left outer join works. It's pretty cool. The other thing we need to do is work on query optimization, and one of the bottlenecks usually becomes like, hey guys, we were running this query against Looker or whatever, and once we start to increase it to different time ranges or bigger time ranges, it starts to time out. And what data team tries to do is to provide constructs for creating optimized views when query patterns get too complicated. Analysts need to be able to write basically summarization tables back to the warehouse. So, if they can work with us to figure out like, oh, well, we don't actually need to look at all the individual call detail records. We just need to know, a grouping based on this dimension, right? We just need to know the number of calls per area code and daily counters of that data. If the analysts are empowered to write in a certain manner back to the warehouse, write these summarization tables back to the warehouse, it really helps speed up performance and iteration. Another thing we have for supporting an organization's data needs and helping to remove bottlenecks is we schedule this by actually weekly kind of unblocking time that we like to call data office hours. So this is like a safe space where you can come in and interrupt us and we won't glare at you. And we will basically try and figure out and triage what your data request is, if we can handle it in our current data warehouse offerings. And if not, what kind of data transformations or new data loads do we need to do to get you unblocked?
Interesting. How much time do you leave for that a week?
Yeah, so we leave 1.5 hours for that per week, and it's been a big success. And then I think the last thing I want to touch on for supporting an organization's data needs is provide a way to reuse the different concepts around the company. And maybe we can get to this later on the governance question, but the LookML layer at Twilio has been a really instrumental part of aligning different definitions across the company. So, for example, our finance team uses the Looker definitions and measures of things like a net billings or a pace calculation as canonical. So if we can, consolidate and define certain dimensions and measures in a single place, like a BI tool, then that reduces a lot of overhead around confusion and people trying to calculate things different ways.
That makes sense. There are some questions coming in about governance, so I'm glad that you even brought that up just now. Jessica, do you want to add anything? What Charlie said? Or,
yes. Yeah, definitely. As a data analyst / business user, I'm also on a very cross-functional team. So sometimes I also need to borrow concept I also need to work with, for example, finance to understand how do they calculate ROI, so I can apply that into my analysis. So my recommendations and feedback are consistent in terms of measurement. And also, I definitely benefited from the office hour that pretty much every week I may have a number of questions, and it may be a little bit abstract to discuss in the emails because there are a lot of moving pieces. So, and also for me, I also went through like a learning phase about the tool as well. So with this media buyers, I can go into their office hour and learn more in detail, and also talk about like, like what kind of other things other teams are using. So it becomes a really good platform for me to communicate my business needs as well as learning, either the technical side of Looker as well as what other parts of the organization, how do they use Looker as well.
Yeah, that's great. Zach, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Charlie covered really a lot of the key points, and I know we only have 20 minutes or so I don't want to take up too much time. I think the reusability model is really something that teams can use to dramatically increase the efficiency with which they support queries. So being able to calculate something like that pace of account growth and then have that live in a canonical form and be able to slice that by channel, by demographic, easily filtered by date without having to go back to a data team is going to allow you to answer a really wide range of questions with sort of minimal analysis done by the data team. And that kind of leverage creates a lot of efficiency. So I think Charlie kind of covered that, but I would say that's the biggest one I've seen.
Yeah. Hey, this question actually, I've seen in one or two questions, audience is asking a lot of great questions. So we definitely want to make sure we have time for that. But certainly one or maybe more people have already asked, how hard is this to learn? So is it hard to learn self-service BI, which is our question number 3. So people are asking about skills and how hard it is. So maybe we can get to that question. And we also had, about some best practices for getting past organizational hurdles with self-service BI, if that's part of it. But, it looks like the audience questions, are around the skills and how hard it is. So we can focus on that part of this question, I think, because we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So Jessica, maybe you want to start with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the UI is pretty straightforward. Basically, I can look through all the views/tables available there and drag and drop all the columns I need and pivot things out. And also the best part is that it comes with visualization of the data, so it's really easy for me to share my findings and the trending analysis with my internal client. There also, Charlie and his team also has a number of example reports for me to kind of iterate on, so that also makes things easier. Another thing we kind of like another process we developed kind of along the way is how to updating the Look ML, because sometimes I need to append additional information, for example, like how like the event people trigger downstream or some other measurements, for example, the net billings from defined by finance. So I actually, so at the beginning we talked about how can we join all of those views together and how to write Look ML. So I think there's with the metadata as well as some of the example reports, I was able to write the Look ML script, but then we also, nowadays we can also submit a pull request, so the data team, they can look through the code we submitted and then deploy it into the production environment. So so nowadays I think we've been streamlining this process and make things much more efficient.
Yeah. Yeah, my thoughts on, is it hard to learn self-service BI? I would say, yeah, it is a little bit difficult. You can't just go and tell like a relatively non-technical analyst, well, just learn SQL or just learn to write your own MapReduce jobs and, the data's there, you can go query it. I think we've learned a lot along the journey. It's hard, but the thirst for data across Twilio is a hugely powerful incentive. So the different constructs that we've tried to provide to make learning self-service BI easier, involve office hours, different tech talks and workshops on SQL, and basically getting people's feet wet. A lot of metadata documentation and sample reporting. So along the topics of metadata and sample reporting, I would say Looker has made this really easy for us. They have this really cool kind of share link feature where you might be crafting some report in Looker, and then if you just want to share that exact report with the same filters and the same dimensions and the same measures, you basically just send over a URL shortened link to the other person, and that report shows up as is on their screen. So that really has helped us do a lot of iterative reporting. So now basically what we do is well, here's this very simple sample report to get you started. If you wanted to add another field to this report, this is how you would do it. And then people kind of get the light bulb in their head and kind of take off running after that. So I think we've gone away from telling people hey, just learn SQL, or hey, figure out this MacReduce job, to starting people off with a sample report, and then trying to foster an understanding of a broader view of the data warehouse. What is available, what is not, how do you work with the data that's already there, and then how do you triage a data request from, okay, I can search for these fields and see if they're available, and so this request is doable, I can figure out how to do this myself, or how do we get an analyst to ascertain whether whatever they're trying to do actually needs some data team work, right? Oh, okay, I realize now that this dimension is not, I cannot calculate this from the fields in the warehouse, so I will need to go to data team and ask them to build this dimension or pull it from this other table or whatever.
Right. Yeah, those are some great best practices.
Yes.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, we see that also in our TDWI research when we ask, can business people just do everything themselves? Is it easy to learn? It's like a 50-50 thing, where the IT people are responding, no, they can sort of do it themselves, but they're going to need some help. And so these best practices, the four you gave, are really helpful, I think. Did you have anything else to add? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I think we should move on.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good. I don't know, Zach, did you have anything to add about that? There's a lot of great questions coming in, so I want to leave time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would just reiterate what Charlie said, just lowering the barriers to entry and removing friction points for people, whether that's kind of embedding visualizations into an intranet or even putting it into Salesforce so that, when a salesperson logs in, they're immediately seeing some form of data, like a visualization that they care about in the place that they're working every day. That kind of thing can be really useful as kind of a gateway, and also making it really easy to share so that people are having conversations around the data and having a dialogue. That's going to get more people exposed to it, more people excited about it, and I think that can really drive adoption.
Right. Hey, let's just do this last question, this question number 4 last. This actually relates to a question or two that I've seen come in about, people are asking about Agile and office hours, and so how important is speed and flexibility? And we can get to the office hour question afterwards because I think it's interesting, but the person was actually also talking about Agile, and do you have an Agile approach? But let's just, talk about speed and flexibility just for a minute or two before we start going over the audience Q&A. I don't know who wants to start off with that. Charlie? Jessica?
Yeah, I'll start off. Sure. So, our assessment of this question is pretty short. Yes, speed and flexibility is incredibly important, especially at, what used to be a pretty small company at Twilio. Everything moves quickly, and we know that reporting requests don't really work out when you're just throwing a request over the wall and hoping for a turnaround from some engineers. People need to be empowered to iterate on their analysis. The first pass is almost never the correct one. So if we can give flexible access to the data we have available, anyone being able to log into the data warehouse at our company and perform analysis as long as they know SQL, anyone being able to log into Looker and click around, that sort of enablement is really important to us. And it's one of the big reasons we're happy with Looker. As long as you can mold your report into a single SQL query, changing filters and dimensions in Looker is super easy, and people immediately understand once we hand them a sample report. They're like, oh, okay, well, now I see all the fields, and I actually wanted this extra field attached to it, so I just click on it. And even changes in the dimensions and the underlying model are all within reach, right? We can kind of say, well, yeah, if you want to be an advanced user and you want to change the actual underlying dimension, we can point you to the LookML docs. They're all very well written, and all those changes are within reach. We're not blocked anywhere.
Right. Jessica, Zach, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I definitely also since I'm on the business side, I'd say startups direction-wise things move really fast, and sometimes we need to look at things from different angles, So that's why I feel like flexibility-wise, it's really great that, we can pivot things out, slice and dice, and also change the LookML layer when necessary. So basically, instead of, manually working on things, we can easily just change some of the parameters and massage the data into what we need, so we can, spend less time in terms of manually massaging the data, but spend more time actually looking into what the data is telling us, looking into the story behind it.
Yeah, I would just add, to the extent that you can avoid predetermining what people will need and what questions they're going to want to answer, and allow them rather to be flexible in how they iterate on the questions they're asking or the way they're looking at it, you're going to get to real answers a lot faster, and you're going to get to better answers. So, providing a self-service tool and also providing access to the full data set rather than to subsets, those things are going to remove a lot of the restrictions on the amount of questions that people can answer. And then the other point is, I think so many teams are collecting so much data, like Twilio, and a lot of teams are moving off of, what you talked about earlier, Fern, as kind of the first stage where you're downloading things from the database into Excel, and there's a lot of potential value in the data that hasn't been realized. And I think it's sort of a ratio of 1 over, the time to insight and the speed at which you can answer questions. So I think the speed really dictates, again, kind of the leverage that you're going to get out of the data. So I think it's quite important.
Yeah, I agree. With that, I think it would be great, Linda, for you to move us into the audience Q&A if you want to start teeing that up. I think would be great right now.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Fern. We do have a lot of really good questions coming in from the audience. I want to start with one about governance, because Charlie touched on that a little bit, and there have been several questions about it. So, Charlie, just combining some of these different questions, how are you handling data governance there at Twilio? What sort of governance do you have set up to keep that single version of the truth and still remain agile and give users access to the data?
Yeah. So the way we like to think about data governance is, we try and establish a partnership between our team, the analyst team, and the backing data producer team. So, for example, one of the great partnerships in Twilio is the transactions team, or the billing team, which basically handles all of the billing system and the financial transactions that are going through Twilio. And then the financial team, right, the finance, FP&A, accounting, those types of people, they are essentially the analyst team, and then the data team. So once we get a partnership between those 3 teams and we all sit down together and explicitly say, okay, this is the canonical data set that we are going to expose for any sort of financial analysis at Twilio. The transactions and billing team says, okay, we're going to feed data to you in this way. The analyst team says, okay, we are going to consume data, through Looker, through the LookML models. And then we say, okay, well, we will support you guys in that endeavor. And then any changes that need to be affected in the LookML model, Jessica touched on this briefly, but we have this pull request model. So anything that is being changed, a new definition of account or a new definition of an active, I'm air quoting here, account, or a new paying customer, also air quotes, those definitions all get reviewed by our data analyst, who is our sort of liaison between data team and finance. So those get reviewed. We double check that everyone is on board with this. Our data analyst goes and double checks with any of the affected finance users. It says like, okay, well, this model is changing. Are you on board with this? We're only going to look at upgraded accounts or something for this dimension. Everyone says, okay. LookML ends up being that pivot layer, right? That, okay, well, this is the canonical version of what this dimension means.
Yeah, and from my perspective, as the company gets bigger and bigger, each team have been more and more diversified in terms of like what kind of user segmentation they use, what kind of definition they have to tag specific users. So it's really great to have a centralized data team that we can keep everybody on the same page in terms of, like the definitions as well as the data available.
That's great. Thank you. Here's a good question for Fern. I'm going to put this slide up on the screen because the question's about this. Fern, in your presentation, you have this slide which shows that self-service BI usage will be dropping in the next several years. An attendee's asking, what's the reason for that?
Oh, okay. Sorry if I didn't explain this properly. So this was, what are you using now? What are you planning to use 3 years from now? So actually, you should be adding those two numbers together. So this is saying in the case of the self-service BI now, 50-something% of people are using self-service BI, and then another close to 20% plan to use it in the next 3 years. So it's really 50 plus 20. So it's not dropping. It's actually going to increase.
Gotcha.
So I hope
okay.
That's clear. Yeah, because these slides will go out, so it's good to get that.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Okay.
Okay.
Excellent. Let me see. Let me bring our Looker speaker, Zach Taylor, into the conversation. Zach, maybe you can tackle this question. Any advice on exposing personally identifiable data, PII, to self-service when you're using self-service BI? That's a problem. This attendee says at our company it's a huge problem to get that secure data out there to users. We don't want to do that. Do you see that out there with customers?
Yeah, so basically the question's around governance, like how do you manage different roles and groups and make sure that sensitive data is in the right hands? Or is it, I guess it could be that, or it could be construed as like how do you obfuscate that so that people can use the data without actually getting access to something that they shouldn't have access to? I think having a centralized governance mechanism, typically in a BI tool, that makes it easy to assign roles and add filters to things that manage access is probably the way that we've seen the most customers manage that. There's different like technical approaches to that, which I probably won't go into, but just having some centralized control of governance that the IT team can manage and then disseminate, I think is probably the best way to manage that.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Comes back to governance, I think, as you said. Here's a great question. The attendee says, I love the concept Charlie shared about free IT hours. However, is 1.5 hours a week really enough to keep that agile flowing? Charlie, can you address that, how that's working? That was a really interesting comment.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not sure if this question asker means the agile software development method or model, or just the concept of agility. But I'll talk a little bit about office hours and how they work. So most of the time, the triage of office hours becomes, okay, well, can we fix this in 5 minutes, right? Like, can we basically teach you the basic Looker model that you are trying to access, or can we show you the existence of some table and all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, I just didn't know that table existed, and now I can create my report. Other times they become, sort of research projects, I like to call them, where it's like, okay, well, you're coming to us with a need, and our current data warehouse or our current data offerings don't actually, satisfy that need, not without a little bit of research. So then the data office hours triage is, okay, well, tell us about your needs. Let's try and sit with you to document the actual requirements of what you're trying to build, and then we'll ship it over to our product manager, who will put it onto our next 2-week sprint development cycle. So then data office hours then, for those people who can't get their questions immediately answered, becomes a sort of new product requirement gathering ground. Yes, and then we can kind of prioritize it and put it into our generalized workflow.
And I actually might tack onto that one. So we also internally have office hours, and basically the people that are hosting office hours are the people that are developing the model. But we also have business analysts who are sort of a person within each department or a couple people within each department that understand the metrics and understand the data probably better than the rest of the business users on that team. And they are constantly available and injecting data into conversations and meetings that we're having. So there's sort of multiple layers, and I think the business, the pure business users can go to those business analysts, and then the business analysts are typically the ones that are going to the office hours to get support from the more technical kind of core data team.
Yeah, great, thank you. And on that note, we're just about out of time here. I want to thank our speakers. That was Fern Helper with TDWI, and our panelists today, Charlie Hsu and Jessica Zan, joining us from Twilio, and Zach Taylor with Looker. I want to remind everyone we did record today's event. We'll be sending you an email with a link to the archived version. And finally, I want to invite everyone to visit tdwi.org for more in-depth information and education on topics like these. That includes the Analytics Experience, a new event in Boston at the end of July. It's an event for business and technical leaders. It will feature classes, peer-to-peer sessions, case studies, training, and plenty of professional networking. Again, I encourage you to visit tdwi.org for more information. And on that note, from all of us here today, thank you very much for attending. This concludes today's event.
Thanks, everyone.